Hi everyone, I'm Alex Fisher and I'm an occupational therapist in the West Midlands Regional Huntington's Disease Service, and I volunteered to give this talk because number one, it's something that comes up in my practice pretty much on a day-to-day basis, but also the fact that it's coming towards the mid to end of the Huntington's in Mind awareness campaign for HD Awareness Month, and we thought that it was really relevant to the campaign. If everyone's sitting comfortably, then I'll begin. This is on capacity in Huntington's disease, and it's the basics for everyone. So this is for whether you are a family member or a professional. So what are we looking at today? Well, first of all, what do we mean by capacity? Then the importance of clarifying other words when having discussions around cognition and capacity. And then what's so different about HD capacity issues and what can we do? So capacity, what do we mean? Well, we usually speak in everyday language about a person having the capacity to do something. And by that, we mean time, effort, physical capability. But for today's discussion, we're talking about the legal use of the word capacity as aligned to the Mental Capacity Act, which is designed to protect the rights of the individual to choice, but also to protect them from harm. Now, there's a test under the Mental Capacity Act to test for capacity in this context. And there are two parts to this. Number one, does the person have a temporary or permanent impairment of the mind or brain? So that's called the diagnostic test. And then number two, can they retain, recall, communicate, and weigh up details specific to a particular decision? That's called the functional test. And notice that I've underlined specific to a particular decision. This is really important because often you'll hear people that aren't familiar with the Act saying, well, they have capacity or they don't have capacity. And what I would do is I would encourage you to say, in what decision? So in other words, a person does not just have or have not capacity, it's decision specific. So these are other words that are often used within this context, and they're quite important to decipher a little bit because it can be a bit confusing. So if you're not sure, clarify. So if somebody says so-and-so lacks capacity, ask them, what do they mean? Do you mean capacity as in doing, or do you mean capacity as in mental capacity? Because it's quite a common word that we use, particularly in health and social care settings. Then we get words and phrases like they have insight and they have awareness, and that's usually followed by therefore they must have capacity. I would say to you that insight is a descriptive phrase. It's the ability to appreciate specific ideas associated with their illness. So a person can have the insight into their movement, or the person can have the insight into having a memory problem associated with their illness. But it is not a legal term, so it does not replicate mental capacity. That's really important. It does represent a very serious cognitive problem for many people with HD, and so therefore is a description of this. So we have people who lack insight into one area and have insight into another, and we have some people that lack complete insight into their illness, and therefore, of course, that's going to affect capacity and decision making. So yes, here we go. I've said the same is true for awareness. It's a description. So you can have insight and awareness into one area and not another. And then lastly, a very common phrase that's often used is that the person is in denial. Now, this can be psychological denial, which can be true in the early stages of the illness, but latterly, certainly in the mid to maybe late stages of the illness, probably represents cognitive denial. In other words, it's due to the organic influence of the illness. Indeed, even if we must use the phrase denial at all. Other important words that we use are things, particularly in Huntington's disease, are executive dysfunction. So this is where people have difficulty in cognitively pulling together the required information, usually for a complex decision, such as flexible thinking, organization, judgment of risk, prioritization, future thinking, and problem solving. So think about it, you might have all of the knowledge, but maybe not have the glue to pull it together. And that's what executive function is. It's the glue that pulls everything together. It's the chief executive of your company. It's the conductor of your orchestra. And so those people that have executive dysfunction have problems in this area. And that's really common in HD. So therefore, sometimes we talk about executive capacity, and that's demonstrating problems or perhaps no problems in decision-making which require executive skills. So those things that we've just spoken about. And then the other key phrase, important words, are best interests. So this is a decision to be made for a person who has been proven to lack capacity into a specific area, and therefore we must take into account their best interests. In other words, their wishes and values, advance statements, and other legal arrangements in place. So their best interests, not ours, their best interests. So here are some rules that you must abide by. A person must be assumed to have capacity in a particular area unless you suspect otherwise. Person is entitled to make unwise decisions. We're all entitled to make unwise decisions, but we must remember that. So, okay, have they always been that way? And why is it that we are suddenly labeling it particularly difficult for them? Have they suddenly lost capacity? What's that about? We must try and think through these things. If you think that a person is struggling with a decision, you must demonstrate that you've optimized their ability to make that decision. Can you put off making the decision until the person regains capacity? For example, would they normally make this decision, so therefore are they depressed? Or actually, if it's come on acutely, perhaps there's an infection in the way. That needs to be looked at. And therefore, is there a least restrictive way of supporting the person? Okay. And this is where you can get a little bit creative. So a least restrictive way of supporting the person rather than depriving them necessarily of what they wish to do or want to do. And therefore, here we come back to any decision should be made in their best interest. So, okay, so you're doubting a person's capacity in a particular area, but I need to draw your attention to that there are certain decisions which cannot be made on behalf of the individual, and these usually relate to other legislation. And there's a full list of these in a booklet. It's actually quite a tome, actually, called the Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice, which is freely available via gov.uk. And it has scenarios, so it's actually very easy to read. And it lists these particular decisions on pages 16 to 17. So there are things like divorce, marriage, consent to sexual relationships, and so on. So really complex decisions. And then we've got, well, okay, who can carry out these assessments? Well, I think it used to be thought that actually it just was psychologists or it was psychiatrists only. Actually, the code will say that anyone, whether formal or not, can carry out the assessment, providing they have knowledge of the decision to be made and they are working alongside of that person. So they must be acting in accordance with the Mental Capacity Act, and they must be able to detail reasoning as to why they did what they did if challenged. So again, in the Code of Practice, page 55 onwards, there are some really nice real life scenarios of what's going on. So whether you are a formal carer, an informal carer, family member, whether you are a health professional, I really recommend you go to this document. But okay, so here we are today, and we're looking at Huntington's disease specifically with regards to capacity. So why do we need to be particularly aware of it? Well, cognition, that's thinking, is affected before we see any movement, if any, as many of you will know. Now, although we know this, it shouldn't bias us to immediately think that it's cognition that could be causing the concern. So again, in line with all of the other things that I've just said, you need to explore other stuff first. Because people with HD are subject to all of these other things. I think it's very easy sometimes to say it's just the HD. But if we've done that and the concern is still there, then we need to explore the issue of capacity, and we need to remember that it's decision specific. And this is where we come down particularly to Huntington's disease. And this is the thing that I often see causes confusion with family members and with professionals. The issues are often with regards to executive dysfunction, and that's the bit that you need to test. And then the other complex bits in HD are refusal to take part, and then a fluctuating presentation, so ebbing and flowing, ebbing and flowing. So just about to look at that in more detail. So I know this looks a bit wordy, but actually, hopefully you'll find it relatively okay to understand. So executive capacity, remember, it's that glue that holds everything together. It's the problem solving, it's the judgment of risk. And so you can think about it. What will be happening is that a person probably with HD, if you ask whether they can retain and recall information, chances are that they'll fly the capacity assessment. But chances are that they'll continue to be doing the same thing over and over again, and the risks get greater and greater and greater. And at that point, you might be thinking, maybe there's a problem with executive capacity. So in other words, are they able to identify that there's a mismatch between their ability to respond to questions in the abstract and the action when faced with these particular situations? And you can see that actually sometimes this can be so complicated that if we ignore it, the risks just build up, and people can be exposed to substantial risks. In Huntington's disease, that can be things such as financial risk, but often I see it quite frequently in terms of self-neglect. So, okay, that person has that choice to self-neglect. Well, hold on one second, do they? What were they like previously? It's only speaking about a gentleman last week who used to be the man that wore a leather jacket and used to wear Brute, and now is living in relative squalor. Is he making a choice, or is this as a result of problems with his executive capacity? Because we've spoken to this gentleman and actually he's, everything's fine, and he can respond really, really well. But actually, what is he doing in vivo? And can he talk you through that? Chances are that he can't. And this is where this comes in. And this is where you need to get very clever in designing your capacity assessments. So yes, so I've taken that scenario and I'm talking to this gentleman and he's saying everything's fine, but then what I'm doing, so we're talking about it in the abstract, but then actually in reality, he can't bring to mind the information when he needs to implement it. So what you've probably got there is you've probably got this repeated rinse and repeat of these risks, and they're building up and they're building up. So you can see that actually, perhaps if you've only noticed it once, okay, you can make the assessment, but you can't come to a conclusion. But if it's happening over and over again, you're adding layers and layers and layers to your assessment. So there's this, you can only reach a finding of having a problem with executive capacity when there's that repeated mismatch. So there needs to be clearly documented evidence along the way of this repeated mismatch. And then what you do is you test that, and you come to some form of decision as to whether that person lacks capacity for this reason. And then what you do with your documentation, if you conclude that, you must explain how the deficits you've identified and documented relate to the functional tests in the MCA, Mental Capacity Act. So is it about retention, recall? Is it about communication? Or is it, as it usually is, in weighing up the risks and benefits of a particular scenario? So that's executive capacity. So you can see how it can work. You've got to be really observant. You've got to document well. You cannot base it on one assessment. It's probably over a period of time. And then you can support that person in reflecting on it. And if they can't reflect on it, and there's a complete difference between the way that they're acting and actually what they're saying, and that sits in the weighing up, chances are you'll come to the conclusion that they lack capacity in this particular area. Refusal. Okay, so as many of you know, sometimes people with Huntington's disease refuse to engage with health professionals, refuse to engage with family members. But I suppose a key question is, it's important to distinguish between a situation where the person is unable to take part in the assessment or unwilling to take part in the assessment. And there's a distinct difference. So if we think that they're unable, what we need to think about is we need to think about persuasion. Can they help us understand? Can we give them choices around where and when the assessment is undertaken? What's this about? If they're unable or they're unwilling, is it about embarrassment? So we can get quite creative again. If they're refusing, why are they refusing? Are they being coerced in some way? Is somebody placing pressure on them? And that's again where this links into safeguarding and good safeguarding practice. Ultimately, though, it's important to tell you that it's impossible to force a person to undergo an assessment. But what you need to do is you need to demonstrate that all steps have been taken before you come to the conclusion where you think, okay, now what? So it might be that it can wait. And again, can it wait? Or are there really high stakes for this person? High stakes for them and for any of the parties involved? Because let's face it, it usually involves more than one person. And at that point, it may need to go to court of protection. And this is not something that we should be worried about. This is actually a place that is designed to try and resolve some of these problems for individuals. And it sounds scary, but actually can be a very, very supportive place for both professionals and people with HD. And what they will do there is they will undertake independent assessments. So they'll look at what you've done, and then they'll bring it in front of a judge, and there'll be for and against, and there'll be independent assessors. And then here we have fluctuating. So as we know, sometimes a person with HD, their cognition can ebb and flow on quite a regular basis. So the law basically tells us that if it's a one-off decision, it may be possible to put it off until the person's, the impact of the person's condition upon their decision making is resolved or diminished. And at that point, what we should be doing is we should be proactively recording the person's decision, so that the next time that this happens, and it will happen, you've got evidence to show what they might want in the eventuality that they've lost capacity at a future point. But sometimes decisions aren't just one-off decisions, and they need to be repeated over and over again, particularly with regards to, sort of looking after physical health. And it requires a multitude of micro decisions during the course of the day. Now, the Act says that capacity assessment is time specific. But in the case of fluctuating capacity, the Code and the Act does say that it's okay to take a broad view. So during the day when that person might be taking the decisions in question. And the reality is that if there are only limited points of the day when they're able to make a decision, it's usually appropriate to proceed on the basis that they might lack capacity to do so, particularly when the consequences are very serious. So think about, if it's a one-off decision, what do you do? Can you wait? Can you not wait? What are the stakes? And actually, if it's repeated decisions, you can take a broad view, and the law allows you to do that. But again, document, document, document. And I would suggest that you're not making these decisions necessarily by yourself. Seek support if you need to. And then lastly, and I think this is really, really important, HD is a degenerative disease. So review regularly. So these assessments should not be static. They should be dynamic. And they particularly should be reviewed when there have been changes in that person's life. My clinical experience is that often that's when you see the difficulties occurring for people. And you have to ask, why is that? And that can often, for individuals with HD who are very sensitive to change, that can be quite a significant point for them.